40% of Republicans said they believed that the Democrats were running pedophile sex rings. And
Yeah.
so if people believe these things, it's very hard to reach them in terms of, let's talk about infrastructure.
Hello, and welcome to the Politics Girl podcast. I'm your host, Lee McGowan. Let's get into it. Today's pod is a candid conversation with American political journalist and author David Corn. David is the Washington, D.C. bureau chief for Mother Jones Magazine, a major cable news commentator and analyst for MSNBC. He's also the best-selling author of a slew of books about American politics and one of my personal favorite online newsletters, Our Land. I'm having David on today to talk about what's going on with the country, but particularly with the Republican Party. His newest book, American Psychosis, a historical investigation of how the Republican Party went crazy, seems incredibly topical as we watch the chaos unfold in the House of Representatives and see what's happening in the GOP-led states. David knows DC, and he knows politics, and he thought he could give us a little insight into the insanity we're all living through. So without further ado, please welcome my guest, veteran political journalist, prolific TV commentator, and best-selling author David Corn. Welcome, David.
Good to be with you.
Thank you for joining me. And I mean, I've been following your work for years through Mother Jones, now with your newsletter. You're just one of the best political writers out there. And for a girl who named her project Politics Girl, that really means something.
Well, it means something to me too, and I'll be sending you a check in the mail. Thanks for saying that.
Good. I need way more checks. Now, along with journalism, as I said in the introduction, you've also written a ton of books. So just to name a few, you're the author of Showdown, which was about how Obama fought back against John Boehner and the Tea Party, The Lies of George W. Bush. You co-authored Hubris, about Bush and the Bush-Cheney world selling the Iraq war to the American people. You co-authored Russian Roulette, which was basically an insider story of Putin's war on America and the election of Donald Trump. And now you've written American Psychosis, a historical investigation of how the Republican Party went crazy.
You're right. That's all true.
Well, American Psychosis is great because it's basically a behind-the-scenes account of how, sort of from the 1950s on, the GOP has encouraged and exploited extremism and bigotry and paranoia to gain power. And as I understand it, you spent about a year trying to figure out if the Republican Party's surrender to Trumpism was some sort of departure from the norms, or if it made sense for the party to have ended up here.
Yeah, I mean, the book is a history of the Republican Party's interactions and relationship with political extremism on the far right, on the fringes. That could be paranoid conspiracy theory, segregationists, far right fundamentalism, all sorts of different forms of extremism, going back to the days of McCarthyism up until 10 minutes ago. And I kind of started on this book, and I was just interested at the time to think about whether anybody had written a full take on this relationship between the Republican establishment and the far right. I assumed it had to be out there, and I went around looking, and I found no one had actually done a book on this. And you know the expression, be the change you want to be. Sometimes you have to write the book you want to read. And so I took it on myself to examine this, and I found that there's a pretty straight through line. It waxes, it wanes, but from the early 50s until today, of the GOP exploiting and encouraging far-right kookiness, is one way to put it, or extremism, for their own benefit. And that could be McCarthy and the Republicans embracing McCarthyism, which was an irrational, paranoid conspiracy theory that Moscow had taken over the entire U.S. government, including Dwight Eisenhower, as one of the head of the John Birch Society believed, to interactions with Nixon cutting deals with segregationists in the South in order to get the nomination in 1968, Ronald Reagan cutting deals with the New Right and the religious right, the far right, the moral majority, when actually members of the moral majority were calling, or at least saying, that you'd be right under God's law to execute homosexuals, to the Tea Party, to the Bushes, younger and elder, making deals with Pat Robertson and the Christian Coalition, Sarah Palin, and up into Trump. So, I mean, Donald Trump, to be clear here, has done this more so than anyone else
Yeah.
in a clearer, brighter, center stage sort of way, but he's not doing anything that's fundamentally new. The Republican Party, every Republican president, every major Republican president at some point has reached an accommodation and has used and egged on the furthest elements of the fringe right. So that was always there. It always happened. It was kept to the side. It was like the uncle you kept upstairs in the attic. You didn't talk about it. It was undercovered by journalists at the time. It's not a big part of political history, but it was always there. And Donald Trump brought it out into the open.
Absolutely. I always say it's not that it wasn't in the script, it's that they read the stage directions, right? Like it's there, you just don't normally hear it out loud. And all of a sudden we were hearing it out loud.
Yeah, it was something that was to be kept to the side. Goldwater in 1964 made tremendous use of the John Birch Society, which was this group started by a candy manufacturer named Robert Welch, who really believed there was a red under every bed, in every PTA, in every union, in every classroom, in every corporation. He would say things like 90% of the United States is controlled by the communists. And they were considered to be crazy, kook people. It was like QAnon, but without the baby eating and sex trafficking. There was a cabal that had just taken over every major power structure, including the U.S. government in America. But they were hundreds of thousands. They gave money to the Republican Party, and Barry Goldwater in 1964 wanted to use them as the basis, sort of the volunteer army for his campaign. And so he did not want to disavow them. And he even asked William Buckley, who was the godfather of the conservative movement, the editor of the National Review, to go easy on them. Do not disavow them. Let's not drive them out of our tent. Now, he didn't publicly bear hug the John Birch Society. He tried not to criticize them in public, but he made a deal, basically. He wanted them on his side. And there's always been some element like that. Even good old Mitt Romney, who, has shown himself to be a man of principle sometimes, like when he voted to, convict Donald Trump in impeachment. But when he was running in 2011 and the Tea Party was ascendant and people were doubting his conservative credentials, who did he embrace? A man named Donald Trump, who at that time was pushing the racist birther conspiracy theory. Now, Romney himself would not endorse that racist nonsense, but he accepted the endorsement and literally hugged the man who was championing that. So here he was making his deal with the Trumpian devil and accepting Republican extremism because he wanted to get the Republican nomination.
Yeah. So the whole thing is not really Trump, and all of this is no exception. It's a pattern that the Republican Party and the GOP have followed for years, where you're kind of using fear or resentment or prejudice or grievance in a quest for power to use it to your own advantage, right? That it's a way to win elections, to play footsie or to play ball with some of the most extremist forces in America to ensure your party continues to win, despite being the minority, really, sentiment in the country. So when we look back at Trump both sidesing Charlottesville or telling the Proud Boys to stand back or stand by, it's the part that was always, as you said, to the side, but all of a sudden we're seeing it right in the forefront. So assembling white supremacists and neo-Nazis and Christian nationalists and now QAnoners and the rest of the insurrectionists to form a violent mob to attack the Capitol was simply kind of the most in-your-face manifestation of a classic GOP tactic, which is courting and ginning up what you're calling kind of kooks and bigots, and in this case, just setting them loose.
I trace this back to, 70 years back to the 1950s after the World War II, when the Republican Party at that point was completely decimated. And they really latched on to McCarthyism and the Red Scare as a way to sort of get back into power and to try to delegitimize the Democrats, who through the New Deal and supporting World War II, which is two things that Republicans to certain degrees did not, had become ascendant. So Republicans back then started making common cause with some of the most extreme conspiracy theories that you could come up with, that talked about a subversive enemy within the country being the Democrats, and how there was an internal foe that needed to be countered. But that goes back to the late 40s, early 50s. But if you just turn the dial back to say the 90s, you see with the rise of Rush Limbaugh in conservative talk radio, you had the rise of Newt Gingrich in the House, who literally said we have to demonize and dehumanize the Democrats. We have to make people think that they are the enemies of America and treat them like traitors and radicals and bizarre people who don't understand American values. And he created this tribalistic approach to politics that in conjunction with other things going on, started, I would say, radicalizing base Republicans. From there, you had Sarah Palin a few years later, when she was on the ticket with John McCain, saying that Barack Obama was not a real American. He palled around with terrorists, and she raised issues that were adjacent to the birther conspiracy theory, that there was something different about Obama. He was a secret socialist. He didn't really understand America, and further radicalized the Republican base. It basically sent the message to the base that Obama and the Democrats want to get you. They want to undermine this country. They want to actually destroy this country. And then with the emergence a few years later of the Tea Party, you literally had Glenn Beck on Fox saying that Barack Obama was going to set up concentration camps for his enemies, death panels, and had a secret plan to destroy the economy so that he could implement a dictatorship. These are things that Glenn Beck literally said, and John Boehner, other leading Republicans appeared on his show and legitimized him. Here was the Republican Party, as they had done with Rush Limbaugh, making common cause with some of the most extremist, irrational far-right voices out there, and again, signaling to their base, this is reality. The reality is that Obama wants to destroy this country, and we have to do something about that. So you have a couple of decades of the Republicans courting this element in our politics, and John Boehner actually rode this sentiment to become Speaker of the House by getting these people to vote in 2010. And then by the time Donald Trump comes around, he's just saying there's been so much red meat thrown to the Republican base over the last 25 years. No one can throw red meat better than me. So let Chris Christie talk about infrastructure. Let Bobby Jindal, the governor of Louisiana, talk about tax policy. Let Jeb Bush talk about education. I'm going to tell, I know the Republican base better than they do. And so he threw out hate, grievance, paranoia, bigotry, conspiracy theories. There was one rally in which someone stood up and said in the crowd, the Muslims, we got to get rid of them. Got to get rid of all the Muslims. And what did Donald Trump said? He said, well, you know what? We're going to look at that. He knew the base. And the base by this point had been so conditioned by the Republican Party's interaction with extremist elements that they went, 40%, 50%, then a majority went for Donald Trump. So so he was not a break from the past. He was a continuation and acceleration of what had previously happened.
And it's continuing today. I mean, I think it's interesting that you're talking about the rallies with Trump, because he did have a handle on how much red meat they'd fed the base, that they were basically rabid for red meat at this point. And build the wall came from the crowd, not from the leadership. They just hooked onto it because it was going to work. Lock her up came from the crowd, not the leadership. They just hooked onto it and made it work. I think it's fascinating where we're at now, because what you're talking about people saying these ludicrous things about Democrats and how we're evil. I mean, I often blame the Newt Gingrich years of the 90s for where we started with this don't reach across the aisle, Democrats are evil, Democrats are the enemy, this kind of concept where people stop working together in Congress. But the lies and the perpetuation of lies only continues to get worse every day. I mean, look at the ridiculous election for Speaker of the House, right? Look at who Kevin McCarthy is putting on the committees and who the Republican frontrunners are for the 2024 election. I mean, it looks like a party that's holding up the craziest and most dangerous among them now as their standard bearers. Like, I can't even read Republican tweets these days, which, by the way, will not leave my feed. It doesn't matter what I do. I'm looking at Marsha Blackburn without having kind of a visceral reaction. It's like they're not even pretending to be upstanding people anymore. It's just straight lies from leadership right on down. The official Republican Twitter account just posted, in 2 years, Joe Biden has undermined our national security, enabled criminals everywhere, and tanked our economy, right? And I was like, what in the hell are they even talking about? Like, it doesn't jive with reality on any level, but their voters won't know that because their voters aren't listening to the actual facts. As I said, I keep listening to Marsha frickin' Blackburn. She treated America as less safe, worse off, and suffering because of Biden's failed policies and leadership. And by every metric you could measure the government, Biden is the opposite of failed leadership, right?
You know, one of the pivotal figures in the speakership fight was Marjorie Taylor Greene.
This is what I want to talk to you about. I mean, these are the
a few,
standard bearers now.
yeah, just a few, years ago, she was publicly hailing QAnon. A story that I broke was that she was the monitor of a Facebook group that was promoting extremist memes and ideas and also supporting today the John Birch Society. She amplified social media posts that called for the execution of Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama. There was, of course, the Jewish space lasers. I mean, it's really, dumb, stupid, irrational conspiracy mongering. And yet now, she is Kevin McCarthy's top ally. She's telling people that she thinks she has a shot at being Donald Trump's running mate, should he actually get the nomination. And it's, we've been somewhat conditioned over the past 5, 6, 7 years to become accustomed to this sort of absurdity. But if you pause for a moment and just think about how a person like that could be influential within the Republican Party, it's pretty stunning. And it shows, as crazy and as awful as things were in Newt Gingrich's day in terms of tribalism and demonization of the enemy and so on, all that's continued with more stupidity added to the mix. And it sounds hyperbolic, it sounds highly partisan to say things like this. But the Republican Party has really, in some ways, gone crazy. That was my book was titled American Psychosis, because the core belief of the Republican Party was not anything ideological, about taxes or housing policy or national security. It was that the election was stolen in 2020. And it's not that there's not much evidence. There is really no evidence. No one's come forward with anything resembling proof. And yet, 20% of the public believes this as an article of faith. And when you become detached from reality and can't process reality, that's psychosis. So that's why I called the book American Psychosis. It's a political psychosis, but it becomes really hard if you believe that to then talk about, let's do a bipartisan immigration bill, or how do you talk about policy? How do you talk about something like climate change or economic growth if you aren't firmly rooted in the basics of reality, which is there was an election, Donald Trump lost, Joe Biden won. Now let's move on and argue about other things. So it's a tough thing, I think, to just brand a whole party or 20 or 30% of the American populace as being bonkers. But, we have kind of reached that point when they, 40% of the Republicans said they believed that the Democrats were running pedophile sex rings. That's 40% to 60% believe Barack Obama was a secret socialist Muslim born in Kenya. And
Yeah.
so if people believe these things, it's very hard to reach them in terms of let's talk about infrastructure.
Yeah, no, I
And
mean, I'm sure you use the term psychosis in your book very deliberately, for those people who don't know. Psychosis is a condition where you're detached from reality or you don't accept reality. And like you said, it's sort of a political psychosis at this point. I mean, if the word psychosis is probably not best suited to the Republican leadership, but more to the Republican voters, because it's hard not to see millions of Americans, despite, as you said, all evidence to the contrary, collectively believing the election was stolen or collectively believing that Donald Trump is their savior or a chosen one, or that Joe Biden is some pedophilic monster instead of the president. That kind of group psychosis, it moves kind of the way Freudian group mentality moves, like it's as a unit. There's no critical thought left. There's no room for it left. So you can't say, okay, well, let's put to the side that you don't believe the election was legit and talk about infrastructure because it's impossible. But then they're constantly being fed a continual stream of lies by where they get their information, right? So I don't know what we're supposed to do about that because Republicans are also capitalizing on the power of right-wing media and the megaphone of places like Fox, knowing that their voters are no longer going to other sources of information. So they can just keep feeding the lies to them. And I mean, you recently pointed out in one of your newsletters that Tucker Carlson, who is the #1 cable news host in America, just did a piece to his millions and millions of viewers where he blended Trumpist paranoia with JFK conspiracy and then threw in like a Nixon Watergate twist to it. And it was, like you said, it was like listening to someone's crazy uncle that lives in the attic, but it's people's news source. And he and the other right-wing news hosts do this with authority, and they use phraseology like indisputable facts and things that cannot be denied. And these aren't indisputable facts or things that can't be denied, but it's just a continuation of the fear-mongering from the same people that pushed the Great Replacement Theory or pro-Russia disinformation or the whole thing that led up to January 6th.
yeah, and I've reached what I think is the sad conclusion that a lot of Americans can't be reached. There is they are so deeply rooted in, you can call it psychosis, or just deeply rooted in their alternative reality, their bizarre Fox-driven narratives, which often are reinforcing. If someone's going to, if you believe the deep state is out there to destroy Trump and everything that's good about America, anyone who argues against that, well, they're obviously in on the deep state conspiracy.
Right.
And so, my thinking is, okay, how many Americans fall into this category? 20%, 30%, whatever it might be. And it really now becomes incumbent not on us to get them to change their minds, but on those who haven't fallen prey to this to rally together and find ways to contain the craziness. During Cold War days, the big idea was to contain the Soviet Union. You wouldn't change it. You couldn't, you didn't want to get into a war with it because that could have tremendously awful consequences for the entire planet. And so,
Yeah.
how could you contain its, enlargement, its advancement? And I think that's kind of the way we need to look at the current situation, that there are Americans who cannot be won over any longer through persuasion and debates. And
And
so how
facts.
can, facts, how can the rest of us combine together, even across ideological and even partisan lines, so that we protect foundational aspects of our democracy and try to have, decent political conversations and debates beyond the Fox craziness. And it's a hard thing to do. It's a lot of it entails energizing people or getting people to pay attention who are not into politics and would rather watch Dancing with the Stars than listen to your podcast. I know that's hard to believe.
Oh, yeah.
And right, I think that's kind of the task at hand. to have people realize that there is a serious issue here, and that to preserve our democracy and to preserve a worthwhile national political discourse, we need to have folks who at least who agree on reality to form a community, which is a majority position. There are more people in this camp, than in the Trump crazy camp. But organizing them and getting people to see that is the challenge.
Yeah, it's also a challenge that our system is set up to favor the minority, which also happens to
Yeah, I
be
mean
the group of
there are a
people.
lot of institutional impediments. The
Mhm.
Senate having two senators for every state, no matter the size. The
The
Electoral
Electoral
College,
College, yeah.
gerrymandering. I mean, there's a lot of things that give a minority party leverage here, which is
Mhm.
why you see House Republicans in control, and why Donald Trump came very close to winning in 2020, even though he lost by 7 million votes. So there are a lot of institutional impediments that are some might be redressed by reform. Some probably are impossible. The Senate, 2 senators per state rule is going to be very difficult to ever really deal with. Possibly if we add other uh, D.C., Puerto Rico, and other places to the country, and they get 2 senators, there might be a little more reflective balance of power in the Senate. But yeah, our system was set up in a way that minorities can take advantage of certain structural components.
Yeah, but if we don't kind of get it together and find a way to talk to groups who will come together to hold up, like you said, truth, uh, actual freedom, democracy, I think we're looking at permanent minority rule and power that's kind of kept in check by, if you look at it now, fascist or authoritarian means. I mean, with the rise of Christian nationalism and these increasing attacks on women and education and sexuality, we could also be looking at some version of theocratic type dictatorship where God is part of everything. And the fact of the matter is, none of the directions the Republicans are heading us in are good. But the majority of the American public doesn't want to live in an authoritarian country or a theocratic country. So we need to find a way to come together in all states, in the whole country. So we don't just have some sort of a drip, drip, drip taking of our rights until one day we look up and we're like, what? We live in the Handmaid's Tale? Like, when did it
Yeah.
become man in high castle in here? Like we really need to pay attention, which is why, like you said, there's people that would rather watch Dancing with the Stars than listen to my podcast. And it's one of the reasons I do those rants in my kitchen, because they're shorter and they're smaller and people can digest things that are happening in bite-sized pieces, because that's kind of where people's attention span is,
Yeah.
right? And I'm hoping that once they get engaged, then they can come and learn more.
I think it's incumbent on people who want to protect democracy to try to reach people anywhere, any way they can. Whether it's your rants, whether other things on TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and there are just a host of ways to do it. And unfortunately, we live in a very fractured information ecosystem, and it's hard to reach a large number of people through a single means anymore, because everybody's kind of nichified in their intake of informational content, mixing news with entertainment, with shopping, with social media. So it's very hard to get clear shots at people if you're trying to make a case for this, that, or the other thing. But just because something's hard doesn't mean you give up on it. Um, and we're not quite at Gilead yet. There certainly are people who would want us to live in a society like that in The Handmaid's Tale. But you see, some people being, radicalized or inspired or energized by the Dobbs decision. And, we saw in Kansas, in the referendum there, how people came up with a very clever way to
Yeah, it's a
preserve
big
the right,
deal.
the right to the abortion and in the state constitution. And hard lesson, but rights that have often been won, through fights and sacrifice, do not last forever. and you have to continually, reaffirm them, and sometimes you have to go back and fight for them again. So, the religious right has taken advantage of the moment to, uh, in some places, pass abortion restrictions that are not supported by the majority.
At
And
all.
okay, now we see, can the majority strike back and regain these rights and push back these assaults on the freedom of women? It's an open question, but it's certainly, there's reason to believe that it can happen here. And the positive thing can happen, that you can lose rights, have rights chipped away, and then fight to regain them, or find different ways to advance those rights. But this is a long-term process, and if going back, which I'd like to do, to my book, American Psychosis, one of my favorite sections is explaining the rise of the new right in the 1970s, which also came at the same time as the rise of the religious right. In fact, the new right gave birth to the religious right in the late 1970s, and that helped elect Ronald Reagan president in
It sure did.
1980s. And a lot of this was a response to the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, in which conservative evangelicals said, okay, we need to get involved in politics, because we don't, we want to criminalize abortion, recriminalize abortion. In some places it was criminal. And they put a lot of effort into mobilizing themselves and into getting Ronald Reagan elected president. And they really thought that once he was in the White House, he would push to criminalize and outlaw abortion, as well as to do the same with pornography and violence on TV and other things that were on their to-do list. Well, it turned out that Reagan got in there, and while he, talked a good game and supported these people and hugged them and had them to the White House and, gave them, threw some bones in their direction, he would not do what they wanted. He did not push to criminalize abortion and outlaw pornography. He focused more on foreign policy and on tax breaks for the rich, other elements of the conservative agenda. And some of them are really ticked off about this, but they got an idea. And that was, it's going to be really hard to enact these minority positions. The reason why Reagan didn't want to do this was because it was bad politics, right? And and Congress didn't want to ban abortion because it was bad politics, because most Americans did not want to see that happen. So they got this idea. Well, you know what? We understand why the politicians are not going to do exactly what we want. So there's another branch of government out there that no one pays a lot of attention to. It's called the courts. And they spent 40, 50 years focused like demons on the courts, and placing on the courts judges who would overturn Roe v. Wade and be on their side in the cultural, religious, political wars. And, credit where credit is due, the strategy worked. The right,
It certainly did. Yep, it certainly
it's
did.
paid far more attention to packing the courts and the Supreme Court than the left has, and they got what they wanted. Okay, they won that fight. Fight ain't over, and now we'll see what can happen in terms of legislatures, state legislatures, Congress, and fighting back on some of the court stuff.
I mean, that's also why we need people like you and independent media and Mother Jones and hopefully people like me that are doing what we're doing to kind of tell people what's really going on. Because if a third of the country's being gaslit every day, they won't know until it's too late. Okay, so I was talking about our new sponsor, Little Spoon, a couple weeks ago because I was bummed it wasn't around when my kid was little, and now I've been talking about it to everyone ever since. Little Spoon makes fresh, healthy meals and snacks for babies, toddlers, and little kids and delivers them straight to your door. You just put it in the fridge or the freezer and then use it whenever you need it. They have everything from fresh organic baby food with single ingredients to multi-textured purees for older, more mature eaters. They have toddler and big kid meals that are free of junk but taste amazing. Think of things like hidden veggie mac and cheese, chicken nuggies, and pot stickers and gnocchi. They even have healthy snack smoothies in convenient pouches in flavors like strawberry banana shake and purple carrot acai bowl. As I said before, when my son was young, I had this illusion that I was going to be the perfect mom, blending up all these fresh organic meals that he would just love. But it's really hard to be a good parent with all your good intentions when you run out of time and energy. Little Spoon is what I was trying to do, but without the work, delivered right to your door. You get to pick the menus and you can change it up whenever you want. It's convenient and adorable and made with the cleanest, most high quality ingredients. It's also a great thing to give to grandparents to keep in their freezer or for babysitters when they come over. It's a win-win for everyone. So make the chaos of having a little more manageable with time-saving, delicious, and healthy meals and snacks from Little Spoon. Go to littlespoon.com and enter the code PoliticsGirl at checkout to get 50% off your first Little Spoon order. That's littlespoon.com and enter our code PoliticsGirl for 50% off at checkout. Being a parent is hard. Make it that much easier with Little Spoon. I mean, your book, American Psychosis, is basically a story of how one of our two political parties has used the worst elements of our personality and our politics to poison our democracy and our ability really to interact with one another in order to remain in power. And this is just another process of it. Like, they're using democracy. They said, oh, we're not going to get what we want through Congress because it's not popular politics. So we're going to shift our attention to the courts, and the courts will give us our wish list. And now we're looking at a different wish list. Like, we're looking at, you were talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene earlier. She's basically a kingmaker now, right? She's the Freedom Caucus, which is not really that many more than 20 people, which is this anti-democracy, pro-violence, insurrection-dominated Republican group, are now dominating congressional committees. They have made Kevin McCarthy agree to every single thing on their wish list to make sure that they gave him his vote because he wanted to be speaker that badly. So the problem is that what do we do with that kind of chaos that we're seeing in government? Are we just lucky that it'll be stopped every time by a Democratic House or a Democratic president?
Well, we still live in a place where political power is apportioned on the basis of voting. We talked earlier that there's some, that the voting system is skewed in some ways, but not totally. And thus, enough Americans who feel a certain way can come together and create political power to advance their own ideas or to block those that they find detestable. Right now, the American public, unfortunately, we'll see what happens with the Republican rule in the House. Do they want a debt ceiling default? Do they want a bill that will get rid of the IRS and income tax, but impose a 30% sales tax across the board, about as regressive a tax policy as one can imagine? Do they want to see Marjorie Taylor Greene in a leadership position? Do they want to see 37 different hearings about Hunter Biden or not? The Republicans have promised to show us their true colors. And, fortunately, the House is up for re-election in less than 2 years. And, we can see whether this works, this works for them or not. And it's unfortunate that we might have to go through a lot of trouble and damage if they default on, the debt ceiling. If they force a default. Mark Zandi of Moody's a year ago or so said at that time that a default could lead to the loss of 6 million American jobs and $15 trillion in American wealth. And okay, they have the power to do this. I don't, there's no way, if they're committed to this, that I think the Democrats and the Biden administration can ultimately stop it. If they want to go off that cliff, it's like, okay, you want to run off that cliff, we can't build a barrier to prevent that from happening. And so if it happens, well, it'll be a very, interesting political science experiment to see how the public reacts. Now, unfortunately, as I said, that means people will lose their jobs and retirees will not be able to retire. Social Security recipients will be hard pressed if checks don't come. Those who live from Social Security check to Social Security check. So this experiment will be fueled by a lot of suffering.
Yes, but will they blame the right person for the suffering, or will they blame the president and his party? And is that the risk that they're taking?
Yeah, that is a big issue, and it's the responsibility of the Democrats and Joe Biden to make it crystal clear about what they support and what they're doing and what their plan is here versus the actions the Republicans are taking. When we saw Newt Gingrich shut down the government in the late 90s, Bill Clinton did a pretty good job of saying, here's their side, here's our side. And, Gingrich was damn sure that everyone would blame Bill Clinton. And he was completely wrong about that. The public, listened to each, and they saw Newt Gingrich as the guy throwing bombs and throwing a monkey wrench into what was a decent economy at the time and causing the chaos. Now, one of my general beliefs is that many Americans who don't follow politics closely, when they look at Washington, what they want most is to not see a mess. They want to think that people are taking care of business and not throwing bombs and not creating turmoil. Now, we do know that 20 to 30% of the public now on the Trumpian right want chaos. They're like the Joker in the Batman movies. They want chaos. They want to see things blown up. They don't care if the shrapnel comes in their direction or not. It's a cultural fight. They just want to see detonations and explosions and carnage. They want to see the American carnage that Trump, claimed he was against in his first inaugural address, his only inaugural address. Okay, most Americans, though, want to look towards their politicians and believe, whether they agree with them or not, that they're acting in an orderly fashion and they're doing their jobs. Just the same way that if you were a boss and you looked at people in the office, you don't want to see papers and paper clips and envelopes flying around. You want to see work getting done. And so here is the Democratic opportunity not to reach the 20 to 30% who are who want the chaos, who want the disruption, but the others to say, we're the adults, we're trying hard, we want to do what we can to help you and keep the economy from imploding. And look at these other guys. Look what we have to work with.
Yeah, like don't speak to the people that cheer the Joker. Speak to the rest of the people in Gotham City. That's what they have to do. They have to sell those people and
Yeah,
not waste their
to,
time with
yeah,
the people who want to see it burn.
right. I mean, that's what Heather McGhee wrote, this great book, which Todd was eluding me, but the compelling metaphor was looking at some southern communities where they were being forced legally to integrate public pools. Some of these communities shut down their pools. They'd rather
Rather
have
than share
no
it. Yeah.
swimming. They'd rather have no swimming pool in the hot summertime than have to share a swimming pool with someone whose skin color was different than theirs. And okay, that they have their priorities, but it's they don't seem rational to me. To them, they believe they're making a rational choice, right? And so when you're dealing with someone like that, you really have to understand what their motives are and in what direction, if any, they can be moved or if they can't be moved. But if they don't want if they don't want anything to do with black people so much that they'll close down the swimming pools for their own kids, okay, you can't work with that. You can't work with that. So what else do? Then you build swimming pools in the communities that will accept them. You find other ways to turn on fire hydrants. I mean, whatever. You find other workarounds. And that's what we need, now to really be smart in finding workarounds to protect our democracy from those people who are, driven to support authoritarianism, minority rule, and and to get what they want to get, which may not be what we think should be their goals and their desires.
Or even probably what's best for them.
But the thing is, everybody gets to decide what's best for them. I remember at the beginning of the Trump administration, there was a great story. I don't know if I saw it on TV or it was in the New York Times, but one of the early budgets caused a cutback in spending on rural health care, and that led to the closing of health clinics in some rural areas. And they went to one of these areas, and they found I remember one particular couple who now were not getting or would not get the medical care that they had been getting through this federal big government program, liberal program, right? And they said, we understand Trump's doing this, but we still support him. Now, you and I can look at it and say they're not serving their best interests, right? And that seems kind of DUMB.
Counterintuitive. Yeah.
But in their view of the world, they would say, well, we still think he's better than the other side. And, we understand that, we're losing something here, but they still thought they were getting something bigger by staying on his team.
Yeah.
Don't know, can't do much about that.
No, you can't do much about that. And when we look around and we see that, as a veteran political journalist and someone that's been in DC for a really long time, what do you think we can tell people to offset that feeling that we can't do much about those people, to offset the crazy or the decisions that make no sense to us without going crazy ourselves? Because I wonder, how much people are supposed to be able to manage, how they're supposed to handle this, to feel like they're taking crazy pills. How do we handle this and be productive and be proactive and make these choices without actually going into a psychosis ourselves?
I take great comfort in there's more of us than them. The
True.
numbers just show that. Okay, sometimes the craziest people, the loudest people in the room get the most attention, and it can seem like they're setting the debate. People obsess about Fox and all the horrors on Fox, but even Fox, it's a good night for them. 3 million, 4 million viewers in a country the size of 300 million people. We're still talking an audience of 1 to 2, not even 2%, right? So, I think we give them larger than life importance sometimes. And the truth of the matter is that most people do not watch cable news. Most people, unfortunately, do not read a newspaper. Most people do not subscribe to Mother Jones or the National Review, unfortunately. I mean, very small percentage of people, follow all this stuff, which also means that, okay, what did their decisions turn on? Are they reachable? And I think in some ways, the answer is yes. It means a lot of people are not in any one particular camp, which means with the right strategies,
And the right
you can,
messengers and the right people, you could reach them.
and the right organizational tactics, they're reachable. And I don't think it's, about necessarily being in the middle and cutting differences. I think, human beings are story-driven animals, and telling the right story, figuring out how to convey that story is really a big piece of politics that I think a lot of politicians don't fully understand. They don't fully understand how our brains and minds work and how to, hook people in a positive way into a message, into acting politically. So I think there's still a lot of room to maneuver. And it's I write about Tucker Carlson and Glenn Greenwald and other people who are pushing disinformation and so on, but I also realize that there's a lot more going on in the world too, and a lot of people are not fully paying attention, and that there are times when you just got to think about how do you grab them for a few seconds. Often that's around a presidential election or a movement like, say, gay marriage, which came out of nowhere and within a few years had tremendous success. Now, again, we see the right with the Dobbs decision saying gay marriage may be next. And well, they're having a hard time reversing gay marriage. They are once again targeting the LGBTQ community, using, the classroom as a battlefront and drag shows as a battlefront, and accusing people of grooming and associating homosexuality with pedophilia. We see, they've lost the gay marriage or the marriage equality fight, but they're still coming back. Okay, so we see this happening, and people need to fight back and tell the positive side of these stories, make fun when you can of the other side, but not be driven crazy by their crazy. Just realizing and this is, I think, maybe how my book can be useful. That crazy has always, always, always been there through Trump, through the changes in the information systems we use now. It's been able to amplify itself, organize itself in ways that it couldn't do in the past, and also just be more in our face than it could in the past. But
Right.
it's always been there. It's just often you couldn't see it, or you could turn it off if you didn't want to see it, or it didn't have the influence that it has now, and didn't have the recognition that Trump and the party afford it these days. But it's always been there. And so, okay, at times you want to confront it. Sometimes you want to ignore it. But most importantly, you want to have your own story to tell and care more. You need to care more about, in some ways, your audience. And I know I've gone a long time, but one point that I'm often, as someone who's worked for The Nation magazine, Mother Jones, and goes on MSNBC, and who wrote this book and other books, people often say, oh, you're just preaching to the choir. How do you get this message to other people? You're preaching the choir. And I don't know, a few years ago, I actually thought long and hard about this. I said, well, damn, preaching to the choir is a wonderful thing to do. If there's no choir, who comes to the church? Who has a good time in the pews? The choir is the front line, right? They're the ones who are there when it's raining outside, and they still get up and they come to church because they're in the damn choir. They have to come. And you want your choir to be as strong, as big, to sing as loud and boldly as you can. And if if you're making sure they know what's what, then they can do their job. And if they're singing well, then other people will pick up the tune. So I think, a lot of this is not being, you don't want to be psyched out or freaked out by the other side and it's crazy, but you really want to make sure that your side is well fed and it's happy and it's engaged and it knows the chords and the words to the song. And, because you know what? You have control over that. You can you can shape the choir. You can't shape the people who don't come to church.
No, and if any of us have seen Sister Act, we know how good a great choir can be, right?
Yes.
You can fill that church, right? If we do
Yeah.
something that speaks to people and tugs their heartstrings and tells them a good story and gives them a good show and engages them, then we fill our church and then we send those people out into the world to talk to other people. I mean, you're talking about it's the message. It's the right story. It's finding the right people, because at the end of the day, we are the majority and we must speak to the other people in the majority. And that starts at home with organizing. It's not an every 2 years voting thing, every 4 years voting thing. It's an everyday thing, from your dining room table to your barbershop. You're talking about it. And if you happen to be the choir, then sing loud and sing proud.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for joining me today, David. Honestly, I've admired your work for so long, and I really hope people will join me in supporting your amazing journalism. Subscribe to Mother Jones, to your newsletter, Our Land, and check out your books, because in a world of Tucker Carlson's, we definitely need more David Corns.
Well, thank you so much. People can get a free trial subscription to my Our newspaper by going to davidcorn.com. Yeah, David Corn, that's corn with a C.com. And you can check it out. And of course, please follow me at motherjones.com.
Yeah, I can't recommend him highly enough. Thanks again, David.
Thank you.
So that was David Corn, reminding us that at the end of the day, we might not be able to convince the people who cheer for the Joker or the citizens who prefer Trump's American carnage to listen to us or to reason. But we need to remember that they aren't the majority, and the wish list of the leaders who represent them aren't things the majority wants. We need to take our anxiety amidst the chaos and turn it into action. to organize and communicate, to be the person or find that group that tells the right story to bring others into our metaphoric church. We're looking at rough waters ahead, but we'll have a better chance of survival if we stay calm and work together through the storm. I want to thank David for joining us today and you for caring enough about democracy to be here. Until next week, PG out. The Politics Girl podcast is written and performed by me, Lee McGowan, in partnership with the Midas Media Network, and produced and edited by Happy Warrior Entertainment. All rights reserved.